World War One was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and it didn't. How did World War One pave the way to World War Two? Every nation probably has their own story in this trajectory towards World War Two. How did Europe allow World War Two to happen? How did the Soviet Union, Russia allow World War Two to happen? And how did America allow World War Two to happen? And Japan?
Yeah, you're right. The answer is different for each country, right? That in some ways, in Germany, the culture of defeat, the experience of defeat at the end of World War One leads to a culture of resentment, recrimination, finger pointing, blame that makes German politics very ugly. As one person puts it, brutalizes German politics.
It places resentment at the core of the populace and its politics.
Yeah. And, so in some ways that lays the groundwork for the kind of politics of resentment and hate that comes from the Nazis. For the United States, in some ways, the failure to win the peace, sets up the possibility for the next war, right? That the United States, through Wilson, is sort of crafting a new international order in order that this will be the war to end all wars. But because the United States failed to join the League of Nations, you see the United States really sort of on the hook for another generation. In Asia, the story is more complicated, right? And I think it's worth bearing that in mind, that World War II is a two-front war. It starts in Asia for its own reasons. World War I is transformative for Japan, right? It is a time of massive economic expansion. A lot of that sort of economic wealth is poured into sort of greater industrialization and militarization. And so when the military wing in Japanese politics takes over in the 1930s, they're in some ways flexing muscles that come out of the First World War.
Can you talk about the end of World War One, the Treaty of Versailles? What's interesting about that dynamics there of the parties involved, of how it could have been done differently to avoid the resentment? Is it inevitable?
So the war ends, and very soon, even before the war is over, the United States in particular is trying to shape the peace, right? And the United States is the central actor at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Woodrow Wilson is there. He's presiding, and he knows that he calls the shots.
So he was respected.
He was respected, but resentfully in some ways by the European powers, Britain and France and Italy to a lesser extent, who felt that they had sacrificed more. They had two goals, right? They wanted to shape the imperial system in order to make sure that their kind of fundamental economic structures wouldn't change. And they also wanted to sort of weaken Germany as much as possible, right? So that Germany couldn't rise again. What this leads to is a peace treaty that, maintains some of the fundamental conflicts of the imperial system and bankrupts Germany, starves Germany, and kind of feeds this politics of resentment that make it impossible for Germany to kind of participate in a European order.
So people like historian Neil Ferguson, for example, make the case that if Britain stayed out of World War One, we would have avoided this whole mess, and we would potentially even avoid World War Two. There's kind of counterfactual history. Do you think it's possible to make the case for that? That there was a moment, especially in that case, staying out of the war for Britain, that the escalation to a global war could have been avoided, and one that ultimately ends in a deep global resentment. So where Germany is resentful not just of France or particular nations, but is resentful of the entire, I don't know how you define it, the West or something like this, the entire global world.
I wish it were that easy. And, I think it's useful to think in counterfactuals. What if? And if you believe, as historians do, in causation, that one thing causes another, then you also have to believe in counterfactuals, right? That if something hadn't happened, then maybe that wouldn't, that would have worked differently. But I think all the things that led to World War I are multi-causal and nuanced. And this is what historians do. We make things more complicated. And so, there was no one thing that could have, that could have turned the tide of history. If only Hitler had gotten into art school, or if only Fidel Castro had gotten into the major leagues. Those are interesting thought experiments, but few events in history, I think, are that contingent.
Well, Hitler is an example of somebody who's a charismatic leader that seems to have a really disproportionate amount of influence on the tide of history. So, if you look at Stalin, you could imagine that many other people could have stepped into that role. And the same goes for many of the other presidents or even Mao.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that there's a singular nature to Hitler, that you could play the counterfactual, that if there was no Hitler, you may have not had World War II. He, better than many leaders in history, was able to channel the resentment of the populace into a very aggressive expansion of the military and I would say skillful deceit of the entire world in terms of his plans, and was able to effectively start the war. So is it possible that could Hitler have been stopped? Could we have avoided if he just got into art school?
Right.
Or again,
yeah.
Do you feel like there's a current of events that was unstoppable?
Part of what you're talking about is Hitler the individual as a sort of charismatic leader who's able to mobilize, the nation, and part of it is Hitlerism, right? His own sort of individual ability to play off his subordinates against one another, to set up a system of that nature that in some ways escalates violence, including the violence that leads to the Holocaust. And some of it is also Hitlerism as a leader cult, and we see this in many other sort of things where a political movement surrounds one particular individual who may or may not be replaceable. So yes, the World War II we got would have been completely different if a different sort of faction had risen to power in Germany. But Europe, Depression era Europe was so unstable, and democracies collapsed throughout Western Europe over the course of the 1930s, whether they had charismatic totalitarian leaders or not.